Good afternoon, everybody. I am Mike Abramowitz. I am the president of Freedom House, and I want to welcome everybody on this call to the virtual launch of Reversing the Tide towards a new U.S. strategy to support democracy and counter authoritarianism. Last September, Freedom House, along with CSIS and the McCain Institute, joined forces to address a glaring need, the need for nonpartisan, actionable recommendations for the U.S. government to advance the cause of democracy. While Freedom House and our partners have done much in recent years to document the clear erosion of democratic standards around the world, we have our collective work cut out for us to prescribe a concrete strategy for government to deal with this challenge. Thus was born the Task Force on U.S. Strategy to Support Democracy and Counter Authoritarianism. In the interest of time, I'm going to get to our thank yous a little bit later, but I want to just introduce our first speaker today, who is we're very honored to have the United States Ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas Greenfield, who will provide some introductory remarks for us, and then we'll be joined by Senator Mitt Romney in conversation with Nina Easton, the former senior editor at Fortune magazine and currently an adjunct senior fellow at CSIS. So thanks to everyone for joining us. I'm going to now turn it over to the ambassador from the State Department.
Good afternoon. I'm honored to introduce today's event, the launch of the report by the Freedom House, CSIS, and McCain Institute Task Force on the U.S. strategy to support democracy and counter authoritarianism. This report and today's conversation could not be more timely. By Freedom House's own calculations, the world has experienced 15 straight years of democratic decline. That decline is driven by so many factors. Factors like persistent inequality, pervasive disinformation, and populist authoritarianisms sowing seeds of division and distrust. Most frightening of all, over the past few years, we've seen how even robust democracies like our own are far from immune. Democracy is a process. Democracy is not easy, and it's precious. The attacks on the Capitol show just how close we can come to losing it. But even more important is what happened only hours after the attacks. Members of Congress went back into the very same buildings that had been under siege. And they did their duty and completed the business of the American people. That gives me hope. Secretary Blinken has noted, and I agree, that in an international context, it's remarkable how transparent America has been about our challenges. Other places might try to sweep this under the rug or deny the ugly, painful truth of those attacks our democracy has faced over the past few years. Instead, we are bringing our struggles into the sunlight and confronting them directly. We acknowledge, as always, that our nation is imperfect, but every day we strive to make it more perfect. It's that striving that sets us apart, and today represents a remarkable step forward in that effort. Because you can't aim for that more perfect union without a plan. You can't strive without a strategy. So I'm deeply thankful of the work you're doing to draw attention to this challenge. Developing those tangible recommendations to policymakers could not be more important. And this is only the beginning of our partnership. Today, let's remain committed to strengthening our democracy at home and advancing our democratic values around the globe. Thank you.
So thank you, Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, for that introduction to today's event. Our next speaker really needs probably no introduction, but as a member of the Senate Committees on Foreign Relations, Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, the Budget, and Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, our next speaker is a very busy individual, and we are thrilled that he's able to join us today. And we also appreciate very much Senator Romney's principled leadership on democracy issues, both here at home and abroad. So without further ado, I would welcome Senator Romney for an interview with Nina Easton. Welcome, Senator.
Thank you, Mike. Hi, Nina.
Hi, Senator Romney, and thank you so much for joining us today. I know this is a topic near and dear to your heart. We have a lot to cover in just a short period of time. And again, I know we have a lot of regions that again, you have serious concerns about, but I did want to start with this week's news about Afghanistan. It really goes to the heart of a lot of what we're talking about, which is how America can press for, encourage, foster democracy in other countries. Iraq and Afghanistan, I think all of us can agree that those were national security concerns that also became democracy building exercises. And there's a lot of concern that with the announcement this week of a pullout of troops by September 11th, that Afghanistan will be more vulnerable on that front. What does this say? First of all, I want your reaction to that announcement. But secondly, what does that say about both Iraq and Afghanistan say about America and its realistic approach to democracy building?
Well, I note just with regards both to Iraq and Afghanistan that we have troops in various parts of the world, not because we're at war, but because we're trying to keep the various nations from going to war. And preserving peace. And so the idea of just pulling troops out, I don't think necessarily means we've ended a war. It means we're trying to maintain stability. I do hope that the president has a clear plan to provide the kind of stability that the people in Afghanistan deserve. But on the broader topic, let me just note that, and you know a lot more about this, particularly at the Freedom House than I do, but it strikes me there are two sort of reasons why nations become autocratic. And one is just the natural state of things. History has shown, and the founders said, that with time, strong men will amass power, kinetic power ultimately, and repress other people. And that's what's happened throughout history. And you have to constantly push back against that. And there are efforts that are ongoing to help nations push back against that, to maintain institutions that provide for democracy and rule, if you will, by the people. At the same time, something new is developed. And that is over the last couple of decades, China, in particular, Russia to a lesser degree, but the two combined, but particularly China, are using their resources, enormous financial resources, military resources, their cyber capabilities and so forth, to aggressively promote authoritarianism. And the great challenge over the next 10, 20, 30 years is going to be how to get China, and to a certain degree Russia, but mostly China, to become a player in the world, a competitor in the world, but not one promoting authoritarianism and basically seeking to become the world's hegemonic power. That's what they aim to do. That's what they're successful doing so far. So we've got two things going on. One is the natural inclination towards authoritarianism, and the other is the strength of China pushing to create more authoritarian regimes.
And where are we with China? I mean, right now, China is the EU's largest trading partner and is using, as we've seen, using that economic muscle. We've seen that China using that muscle in the developing world, now even in Europe, building infrastructure there around Western democracies. What's your reaction to that and how to counter that?
Well, first of all, China has a strategy. They know precisely how they're going to use their financial resources, their geopolitical strength, their military resources in a way to promote China and authoritarianism. We don't have a strategy. We have various tactical things we do from time to time, but we don't have a national strategy. That would be number one on my list. Number two is I would want to work on our strategy with our friends and allies around the world. Look, with the EU, with other free nations, we have over 50% of the GDP. We can put a lot of pressure on China to get them to behave. Number three, China's entire effort is financed by their extraordinary economic engine. And why are they so successful economically? And that's in part because they don't follow the rules the rest of us do. And we've allowed them to do that, thinking they're a developing nation, and so they can do whatever they want to do. Well, that's wrong. They have to play by the rules, or we have to be able to shut them down from having access to our markets. And so I can go on at great length here, but they're winning. We are losing this battle. as Freedom House has shown, 15 years, democracy is on the decline. Autocratic regimes are rising. You've got nations in the Pacific that are now recognizing China over Taiwan, cutting off Taiwan. This is a very troubling trend, and it all stems from the fact that they have a plan that they're following effectively, and we don't.
What about countries beyond China? I mean, we've seen what happened in Myanmar and other countries around the world. What other countries concern you the most?
Well, the list is so long, Nina, as you know, and I'm not suggesting that China pulls the strings everywhere. Again, there are two streams for why democracy faces battles. One is just the natural tendency of autocrats and men or women of power to amass power and repress their people. But China's playing an active role. And so obviously throughout the Middle East with Iran, China's saying they're going to lend them $250 billion or more. It means that China's going to have a much closer relationship with Iran. They continue to support their economy even now. And then, of course, you turn to North Korea. North Korea, it couldn't exist as an economic entity were it not for its trade with China. Myanmar, also extraordinarily close relationships with China. The military regime could not proceed if they did not have the economic support of China, and this goes on throughout the world. And I would be concerned about the former nations of the Soviet Union, whether it's the various stands, if you will, or the nations of the Baltics. I mean, this is and then of course, I mean, in Latin America, China has massive investments in Latin America, and pretty much throughout the world. Again, they have a game plan. They're moving on virtually every continent that's populated, at least, and they are making progress in those continents. I mean, as you know, their Belt and Road Initiative is a $1 trillion plan. We don't even have a $1 trillion plan for our own infrastructure, let alone using our money to help build our economic infrastructure around the world as they are.
So let's talk about ways in which strategies could work in the United States to turn around this decline in democracy for the past 15 years. The report released today urges President Biden to establish a national democratic strategy and a national democracy council, and to have a diplomacy of democracy kind of bent at the State Department. Is that something that you would urge President Biden to do today?
You know, I think many of those ideas make a lot of sense. My own view that I continue to promote with the president and with his team and Secretary Blinken is that there is if you will, a summit following a lot of work being done by people at the staff level to say, all right, let's talk about what our rules are going to be, what our rules of trade are going to be. And then we ultimately agree amongst ourselves how we're going to enforce those rules, what access China will have to our markets if they follow the rules and if they don't follow the rules. At the same time, I think it's important for us to have an agreement beforehand with our friends around the world about what we would do if China were to invade Taiwan. I think these are things we have to discuss amongst our friends, reach agreement amongst ourselves, amongst our friends rather, and then establish if you will, a collaborative effort on the part of free nations to make sure that we dissuade China in particular, Russia to a secondary degree, from pursuing their strategy of global domination. It's hard for us to imagine the old days of the Cold War. And this is a very different time than the Cold War. But in some respects, what China is doing and what Russia is doing is they're saying, hey, look, we've now got an economic engine that was a lot better than communism and socialism. It's capitalism. Boy, does it work. And we're going to use capitalism to create massive financial resources and then use those resources to do what the old Soviet Union tried to do, which is get various nations to align with them and build a military that confront the United States. So we're going to have to wake up to the new reality. And in my view, that starts with a collaborative effort with our friends around the world.
Yeah, you've pointed that out before, and I think that's a really important, and you've said that that's what's been missing in our policy over the past at least 4 years, is this sense of going unilateral and not reaching out to allies. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And I give President Trump credit for recognizing that China was a big problem and that their theft of our intellectual property was a big problem. It is. That's part of what their economic juggernaut is, stealing technology they don't have to invest to create. They just steal it. And that's part of it. And he decided to confront that. We haven't won that battle, by the way, with regards to keeping them from stealing our technology. But I credit him with doing that. I fault him for not having collaborated with our allies in doing that, because we have a lot more economic might if we combine with our friends.
You know, some people will look at this report being released and say we should be worried about our democracy here at home. When you were in the halls of the Capitol on January 6th, did that go through your mind that we have to stand up to potential rise of authoritarianism here, and we really have to protect our own democracy?
Well, as I said at the outset, there is a natural tendency on the part of the people who get in power to try and retain power. And to amass more power unto themselves. And the founders went to great lengths to try and prevent that from happening. I must admit that among all the things that went through my mind on that day, one of them was that what was happening would be broadcast around the world by those that are promoting authoritarianism. And they would say, see what happens in democracies? See what happens when you let the people rule? And America is not as good as they say they are. It was a very, very tragic day for the cause of freedom, not only here, but around the world. And yes, it's essential that we preserve the institutions that allow us to maintain freedom here. As Mike said, and as the ambassador said, she noted that Congress came back to work. Our institutions here are strong and are able to, and we're able to protect our democracy, but that continues to be an ongoing battle. It will always be a battle. There will always be men and women who try and amass power unto themselves and oppress others.
So give us some perspective from within Congress, the Senate, and the House right now. You're on Capitol Hill. What is the temperature in terms of members of Congress to fight for and protect and have initiatives to support democracy around the world?
I wish I could tell you that's a extraordinarily high political priority. I think instead a lot of people are looking at the elections in 2022, and of course some others are looking at the elections in 2024 and wondering how we can gain a lead in the part of Republicans in the Senate, maintain a lead in the part of Democrats in the Senate. And so the issues that the American voters are concentrated upon are domestic issues. And the Biden administration is spending a lot of money and proposing to spend a lot of money. And people like getting checks. They like getting free stuff. That's the way we all are. And Republicans are saying, no, this is, we shouldn't be doing that. And very little attention, I think, in the halls of the Capitol and certainly on the homes of America is being focused upon what China's doing, what Russia's doing, the advance of authoritarianism, and for that to become a table top conversation point, I think is going to require the White House, meaning the president, to make this an extraordinarily high priority and to communicate this to the American people. And that, politics, as Tip O'Neill said, is all local, and yet these trends globally will have massive impact on the homes and families of the people of America if we don't pay attention to them.
So, Senator, as we wind down this interview, one last question. If you could reflect, and really if you could be as candid as you can, on the past 15 years and this alarming decline of democracy, and what do we need to do? What have we learned, not just about using the words stand up for freedom or stand up against authoritarianism, but what specifically works when you are confronting authoritarians in other countries?
I'm not sure that I've got the answer to that, and the folks at Freedom House and others have been working on these things for years and years. But a couple of things I think stand out. We believed with the Arab Spring and people voting that meant, wow, democracy is here; it's not going to go away. I think we recognize now, in a way that I had not to the same degree I do today, that there are institutions that are essential for democracy to be preserved. And the institution of the courts, of the justice system, of labor unions, of corporate leaders. There are all these kinds of institutions that are so essential. And in promoting democracy, one thing we must be doing is building institutions that will be able to withstand the individuals that will inevitably try to amass power. Secondly, I think we got to be far more effective in marketing who we are and what freedom represents to people. Look, we can convince people to spend almost a day's wage to buy a can of Coca-Cola. I mean, caramel flavored drink. And yet we can't convince them to fight for freedom necessarily. And so we've got to do a much better job communicating. I mean, I believe we should be establishing TV networks and content that we're providing to the entire world and helping people in countries get a better sense of who we are. So number one, institutions. Number two, a much better job in marketing freedom around the world. And then number three, those of us that believe in freedom need to combine with our friends, because the forces opposed to freedom are large, powerful, and they're winning.
Thank you, Senator. That was both insightful and incredibly inspiring at this dark moment moving forward. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Nina. Good to be with you. And Mike, thank you for letting me be part of this today.
Thank you, Senator Romney, for some great remarks. And thank you, Nina, for a great interview. We really appreciate it. We're going to now move to the next part of our program. But before we do, I wanted to circle back and offer a couple of thank yous, because I didn't have the opportunity. I wanted to give as much time to Senator Romney. He had to leave just right now. But the first thing I want to do is really thank our partners at Freedom House. This task force, this report was really the result of a great partnership with CSIS, led by Dr. John Hamre, the CEO, and also Ambassador Josette Sheeran, the executive chairman of the McCain Institute. We're deeply grateful for that partnership and for the fact that you brought the great weight of your institutions to bear on this critical issue. And I would be remiss in not also mentioning the former head of the McCain Institute, Ambassador Mark Green, who's been a good friend to Freedom and to Freedom House over the years. I also want to thank the co-directors of our task force, who are also happen to be serving as senior democracy fellows at Freedom House. They are Alex Thier and Ann Witkowski, whose energy, smarts, and strategy have really driven this effort from the beginning. I also want to extend thanks to our esteemed task force members, each of whom has brought a unique perspective and expertise to this effort. And I want to particularly thank our 5 task force working group leads. I'm really proud that we have experts who have served in past administrations of both political parties, and that we've really shown that not every issue must be polarized along partisan lines. Finally, I want to express exceptional gratitude to Craig Newmark Philanthropies and the Merrill Family Foundation, without whose generosity and support we would not be here today. So we have a great program today. What we're going to do is, in a moment, hear from the heads of our task force and the individual members of the task force going over some of the concrete recommendations we have. But first, we're fortunate to have with us Mrs. Cindy McCain, who is the chairman of the board of the McCain Institute, and also our partner, Dr. John Hamre from CSIS, who are going to be talking a little bit about their perspective on these issues. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hamre. Thank you for being with us today.
Welcome, everyone. My name is John Hamre. I'm the president of CSIS, and I have the great privilege today to talk with Cindy McCain, the wife of John McCain. And Cindy McCain has become a towering figure in her own right on policy matters these last years, and we're so privileged to have her with us. This is a project that the McCain Institute and Freedom House and CSIS have been doing together, and it is about the health and future of democracy. Not only democracy in America, democracy around the world. And there's nobody that was a greater champion of that than the late Senator John McCain. So we're going to have a wonderful opportunity today to talk with Cindy McCain. And Ms. McCain, thank you. I'm so grateful to have this opportunity.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Let me start And this is going to be a bit unusual, but let me start, if I may, in the imagination of our minds to bring Senator McCain back to be a part of this conversation. Let's just pretend that you, Mrs. McCain, and Senator McCain, you've just had dinner with your family on a Friday or a Saturday night, and you're now just together in the living room in front of the fireplace, and you're talking to each other about the world that we're facing. Let me ask you, what would be the conversation the two of you would be having right now about democracy in America?
Well, I think the conversation would probably begin with, at some point, what occurred in our nation's capital and the future and state of democracy, as you mentioned. I know for a fact that on that day, if my husband had been around, that he would have not only been furious, but probably would have charged out there to face him down. I mean, there was no going to a safe room for him. So
that's true.
I also think, though, that he would be very frustrated and very sad for the state of affairs, particularly domestically, in what's happening, because we have seen a demise in the respect and honor that we should be giving our leaders, as well as the respect that our nation's capital and the body deserves. And so I think he would be very vocal, and I know he would probably be reviewing a speech with me or talking about who he talked to that day, or what kind of argument he may have gotten into with somebody on a different side. But he would be, I know, very, and probably up pacing a little bit, because he could walk and talk. That was kind of how he would talk things out. So and I think also our children would be listening intently, because of his vision and his love for this country was so deep that that the whole events of these last few years actually would have made him terribly angry.
Yeah, I was one of that huge crowd sitting way back at National Cathedral, and saw the remarkable testimonies from your family, and not only the spoken testimony, but the visual testimony. People standing in uniform. It was inspiring, and I know that was part of what the two of you did in giving character to your family about the importance of democracy. It sounds kind of sappy, I suppose, but democracy is precious. It was precious to him. I know it's precious to you.
It was, the one thing that we used to tell our children growing up was that democracy is precious, but it needs to be tended to. Democracy is something you have to keep working on, keep believing in, keep trusting in. And I think we've lacked a lot of that. And I know my husband thought that before he passed. We were lacking those true ideals that this country and certainly our House and Senate had believed in.
That's so true. Can I ask your thoughts about the quality of civics education in America? How well are we teaching to the next generation?
I'm really glad you asked that question, because that is a discussion that John and I had on more than one occasion before he passed. In my personal opinion, I think the quality is poor. I think there's a lacking interest in it. I think the more exotic things like football and everything else are getting the greater attention, when we should be paying attention to the most precious thing we have as Americans, and that's democracy and how the democratic process works. And consequently, you see we saw it, and a perfect example is what was going on at the Capitol. Again, sorry to keep referring to that, but we saw, in my opinion, people, and younger people, I don't believe that really understood what this country was all about, what the Capitol was all about, understood what we should be doing as Americans to help, if they would like change, how to facilitate change, not in climbing the walls to our capital, but in how you change from a local and state level. And I made sure, I mean, my husband and I, we made sure that our children had great civics education, not only in school, but of course at home as well.
Yeah.
And I think every parent should be a part of that.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you've called for that. It's a rigging call, and I'm very grateful for it. Yeah, we don't really teach civics in America these days, and we need to. Let me ask, if I may. I remember talking with Senator McCain and actually accompanying him on a few trips. And the topic always was the rise of authoritarian countries in the world and the way they challenge democratic institutions, democratic countries. Share your thoughts with us, please.
Well, I obviously, you traveled with my husband, so you understood and saw at close hand what he believed and how he acted on it. In my opinion, we have had in recent years a leader particularly that didn't really stand up to these authoritative leaders and treat them for what they are: thugs, killers, people that don't believe in human life and believe in human dignity. And instead we saw a man pandering to the worst of the worst. And in my opinion, it did more damage than one could ever do in a lifetime. And so that's where I think we miss my husband, is because he stood up to those guys. They not only knew exactly where he stood, but he stood up to them regardless of what would happen to him, because he did it for the right reasons. And that's what I think we missed in his previous administration. Not only did we miss it, we blew it in this previous administration.
Well, but there were strong voices like yours that were speaking out, about this larger, bigger America. And you took the lead. And I know that there were times when it was uncomfortable to be that spokesperson. How has it worked, in your world? Because you were courageous, and right now we have a lot of people that don't really want to listen to the other side.
Right. Well, I hope if I did anything at all in these recent years, that I followed my husband's lead, and that is working together. In my opinion, I don't believe that we can succeed in anything unless we hear the other side. We don't have to agree, but we can perhaps compromise and work together for the good of the country or the good of the issue that we're working on. Instead, we've seen divisive actions, I know you know, and we've seen people, the more divisive, the better, I think, in some cases, is how people, I think, react and behave. And that's the one. There's many reasons I miss my husband, but one of them is that very reason right there.
We all miss him for that very much. When you and Senator McCain were designing the architecture of the McCain Institute, you decided one of the major elements of it would be the Human Rights and Democracy program. Share with us your thinking as you went through that.
Well, we both, we had great vision for it, and it was really fun working with him on this project, because he has such a mind, and I do. Mine is the other. We used to call it the two sides of the Institute. It's not. We're very much connected, but for me, I thought it was very important, and my husband agreed, that we not only tend to human rights, human dignity, rule of law, but also deal with the absolute issues that cause those. Human trafficking, for example, is one of those issues. How can we as good Americans profess the things that we do without making sure that our own house is in order? And so that's why we began the human trafficking program, was on a domestic level, to make sure that our own house was in order, and that people were indeed being treated with dignity, that they weren't being trafficked, that they weren't being held hostage or enslaved in any way. And it's still happening. So I believe that not only the McCain Institute, but many other organizations out there that work on these issues are critical to what we need to not only continue to profess, but to make sure that the outside world knows what we're doing and that we do believe in what we say and we practice it.
I think you and Senator McCain were visionary on this because you saw into the future and you saw a time when human rights,
Yeah.
democracy is being challenged like
It is.
no time before. And
Right.
it's really crucial to do this. I'm so grateful for your leadership on this.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Let me just, I think everyone who had the privilege to work with Senator McCain occasionally experienced a pretty sharp moment when he got mad. I remember a markup on the Senate Armed Services Committee, and he really lashed out. And I walked up to him afterwards and apologized because I didn't mean to mislead him the way he concluded what I was doing. But I noticed something about John McCain. He never, ever got angry about something somebody said about him.
No, he never did.
What he did, he got angry when he felt that people were disrespectful of the country.
Right.
Or the Navy,
Exactly.
or democracy. That's what,
You're exactly right.
that's what stirred him.
Mhm.
It was something deep inside of him. Where did that come from?
Oh, I think it came from many things. You know, life hands you many experiences. And certainly a great deal of that was his POW experience. He, as he said in his books and has said publicly in statements, he fell in love with his country when he was deprived of her company. And so I think for him, that was where this real love and passion began. Although he was already in the Navy and already serving, I think when deprived of what were the true freedoms and true rights that he deserved, when deprived of them, fell in love with them.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I thought one of the most powerful little speeches that I've ever heard was the night when Senator McCain, conceded the election, and it was powerful. It was moving. Do you remember that night? Do you remember your
very well.
sentiments? Yeah, share with us.
I do. What he wanted to say, and I think he succeeded brilliantly in doing so, was he wanted to tell the country, it's okay to not only is it okay to lose, but to lose with dignity, still love your country, love the people in the country, even though they didn't vote for him, but still love the people in the country, and make sure that other countries saw that in a democracy, there is such a thing as a peaceful transfer of power.
Yeah.
And so I think there are many things going through his mind when putting that speech together, because I was involved in that. And I just thought it was brilliant. That speech is taught in many universities around the country and around the world. And I'm just grateful that people listened to it, because I thought it was beautiful.
It was beautiful. And it was, I honestly, one of the most powerful speeches in recent memory. It really was. It was really great.
Agree.
I remember in his campaign, he went to a town up in New England that had a shipyard, and he was doing a campaign event. There were about 800 people there, and it went through the whole thing. And at the very end, he got to the end and he said, well, I'm surprised that nobody's asked me whether I will keep open the Portsmouth Navy shipyard.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, you didn't ask me, but I'll just have to tell you, no, I'd have to recommend we close it. And here's the reason. Now, I don't know of a politician that would ever do that.
Yeah.
In the face of a community with lots to lose. And he said the truth to them, and he got a standing ovation.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that was John. The one thing you knew you were going to get with John was the truth, whether you wanted it or not. And all of us appreciated that. I think sometimes my kids might not have. They thought that maybe they didn't need the harsh truth, but and that's what was so brilliant about John, is because he was a man of honor and he lived by the code of conduct. So truth and honesty is the key elements in all of that. I was there at that speech and I remember it. And I also remember seeing a very large tugboat go by and blast the horn for John. So it was fun.
Well, it was remarkable. I've never seen anything like it in my life, and I thought it was such a unique insight into his character. We're coming to the end of our time that we have with you. I would cherish the opportunity to talk with you for hours. Can I just ask you? You've been talking about Senator McCain, but I know that he was your life partner, and he relied on your judgment and how you thought about things. What are your hopes now for America?
My hope is that our younger leaders, our leaders that are coming up, our children that are coming up that will be leaders, can learn from my husband's life and from what he lived by. And I hope that through his teachings and the things he has left behind for us to not only understand, but to study, that people will really gather and understand why he did what he did, and more importantly, why people should do the right thing. Doing the right thing, as you know, is not always easy. And John was the first one to say, boy, doing the right thing can really hurt sometimes. But that's what makes a good leader. And that's why John was so very, very ambitious on the effort to have us bring in character-driven leadership as part of the Institute. I would hope that people could learn from him. I would hope that people would miss his kind of politics that we also enjoy, because we do miss it. It's a new generation now. And I hope that we will see leaders live by the kinds of things that John did, and perhaps learn and carry on his legacy.
That's marvelous. My goal in this little conversation was to bring Senator McCain back among us in our imaginations.
Yeah.
You've done that. You've done that.
Thank you.
And thank you for that. I'm so grateful for this. This project is intended to advance Senator McCain's and your vision about a stronger, more democratic, more constructive world. And I'm so grateful that you gave us this chance to talk with you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate you having me. I really do. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to John and to Cindy McCain, not only for participating in today's launch, but really for your ongoing support for our endeavor. Senator McCain, as we know at Freedom House, really leaves a tremendous legacy behind that I know he would be so proud to see his family continue to speak out with integrity and to carry on his legacy. So we're now going to shift gears and get granular and into a discussion of the conclusions and recommendations of our new task force report, Reversing the Tide Towards a New U.S. Strategy to Support Democracy and Counter Authoritarianism. We undertook this effort starting last year, out of concern about the alarming global decline in respect for democratic freedoms that we've seen at Freedom House for some 15 years. We've seen abuses of human rights and assaults on core democratic institutions and practices accelerating around the world. Autocracy is expanding, and we face growing challenges to our international partnerships and the health of international organizations. So to address these new realities, our report recommends placing the advance of democracy and the fight against authoritarianism at the heart of American foreign and national security policy. And we put forth a broad set of ideas to rebuild democratic alliances, strengthen institutions essential to democracy, address the challenges posed by technology, counter disinformation, address corruption and kleptocracy, and harness U.S. economic policy to support democracy. To introduce the report and to kick off a more in-depth discussion, I'd like to give the floor to our tremendous task force co-directors, Ann Witkowski and Alex Thier. Ann and Alex, take it away.
Mike, thank you. We're pleased to be in this portion of the program where we're going to give you a broad overview of the task force effort and report. We'll be going into greater depth on the content of the effort in a conversation with our task force members after this. But here's the broad overview. This effort has been underway since last September, and we've been working together to develop, review, and debate our recommendations. I might add that this effort has been undertaken entirely during the pandemic. Many of us have never met in person, which for me is a little bit unusual. Nevertheless, we've succeeded in producing what you have in front of you today. This has been a working task force with the active engagement of our members. And our members collectively have deep experience in government, outside it, in academe, think tanks, the nonprofit sector, and business. And it has already been said, but I think worth emphasizing, we have members who have served in Republican and in Democratic administrations, and some who have served in both. The task force effort was divided into 5 work streams, each under the capable leadership of an active task force member, working group chair, and a co-chair. And these working groups then brought together their own experts together to provide crucial content for the report. Task force meetings and working group meetings were supplemented by interviews with a number of members of Congress, interviews with current and former high-level officials, and additional experts. And we consulted with civil society leaders, many of whom are on the front lines around the world. Before we turn to the content of the report, I just want to reiterate on behalf of Alex and myself, our exceptional gratitude to everyone who participated in this effort. Alex, over to you.
Thanks so much, Anne. I want to say first that it has been delightful to be your partner in this venture. It's been an exciting journey. You know, we set out in the beginning of the report to create a big picture about the state of the world and really to ask ourselves what has changed? And in fact, why is this task force needed? A couple of things that really jumped out. First of all, as you've undoubtedly heard already, we are now into 15 consecutive years of global backsliding on democracy and human rights. And that doesn't happen by accident. There are bigger trends at play here. But the result of that is that hundreds of millions of people are going to be living under oppression more than were before. It also means that critical allies of the United States have been moving towards autocracy. And as you heard from Senator Romney, authoritarian regimes are becoming more aggressive. They're taking the tools of open societies like free speech and financial flows, technological innovation, and they're weaponizing them against democracy as well as against their own people. And yet we felt that while the consequences of democratic erosion are increasingly evident around the world, the United States and its allies have not squarely addressed the challenges posed by democratic decay and resurgent authoritarianism. So what's the punchline of this report? I think the first is that we have got to get serious. We need a plan. And as you've heard from many of the speakers already, that work starts at home. We have got to get our own house in order to demonstrate that democracies, including the United States, can deliver security, including health security, prosperity, and inclusive growth for their own people. We have plans to deal with COVID-19 and our crumbling infrastructure, but our political leaders have yet to deliver a real plan to redress the global crumbling of many of democracy's fundamental elements, like free and fair elections, independent media, and robust civil society. So our big recommendation here is that the United States must elevate support for democracy and countering authoritarianism as a core element of US national security strategy and foreign policy. In fact, our group felt so strongly that we are recommending that democracy be made a fourth D of US policy alongside defense, diplomacy, and development. So what is really in this report? We've outlined 7 strategies, and it's an integrated set of issues, as Mike already talked about, that is a reordering of priorities and architecture and resourcing for the US government so that we can move from the great rhetoric that we are hearing from the new president and his administration, as well as many bipartisan congressional leaders, and making that a reality. Now, some people will look at this and say, well, we've got so many other problems in the world right now, we need to deal with the world as it is. Some will say, as they did to us in these discussions, that the US has faltered at home and therefore can't talk about democracy abroad. But I think we on the task force believe that democratic values and the importance of them aren't great because they're American. America is great because of the democratic values that it has and has worked to enable around the world. We believe that America succeeds in a more democratic and right-respecting world. So let me very briefly touch on the first two of these strategies, and then I'll turn it back to Anne. The first is that we have to elevate support for democracy and countering authoritarianism to the heart of national strategy. So what does that mean? Well, as you've already heard in an endorsement from some of the speakers, we have recommended that the White House, working together with the Congress and other parts of the administration, create the first ever national democracy strategy that spells out a detailed multi-year vision that puts democracy and countering authoritarianism at the heart of domestic and foreign policy. In order to accomplish that, we recommend that the president should establish a National Democracy Council at the White House that can create, coordinate, and oversee this strategy and its implementation. And finally, I'm going to mention, because I think it's so important, that we should reform and elevate development as a key element of our democracy strategy. We talk about taking an approach of doing development democratically around the world. And I can say, as the CEO of the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, but this is something that we will be taking very seriously in our work. The second strategy I want to highlight is the recommendation that we forge democracy and human rights to create a big tent to build new and stronger democratic alliances. So what does that mean? A couple of specific recommendations. First of all, we want the US State Department to be empowered to embrace a diplomacy of democracy that make these aims a top priority for US diplomatic engagement, so that when the ambassadors go out, the president puts in their letter that this is a priority, and then when they're meeting with all of their partners from heads of state to civil society, they know that that's at the top of their priority list. We also make a number of recommendations for the president's proposed Summit for Democracy. That includes making sure that we use this as an opportunity to drive ambition and success, that we have something like a price of admission so that countries that are coming are making real and meaningful commitments when they show up at the summit, and that we build a multi-year calendar that both leads up to the summit so that there's excitement going in and things coming out to make sure that what is promised at the summit actually gets done. And finally, we believe it's really important that the United States should engage in national consultations at home. The last thing I want to say before turning back to Anne is a recommendation on security cooperation, that we believe that the United States government should elevate and integrate democracy and human rights considerations into security sector assistance, not as a hard condition, but as a factor that should be considered to make sure that that's a part of our strategy. Over to you, Anne.
Great. Thank you so much for that fantastic setup. I'm going to go into the next three strategies. The third posits that we and our partners need to dramatically increase investment in the core pillars of open, accountable, inclusive, democratic society, which have been mentioned: fair and free elections, independent media, and a vibrant, active civil society, which have all come under significant pressure in the last decade with an insufficient response. We have some specific recommendations. One, to set up a new Center for Integrity in Elections in the United States, but that could work closely with elections officials and bodies, not only at home, but also overseas, together with the private sector and civil society, to strengthen threat analysis and effective responses to the threats that election processes are under. We recommend a large-scale enterprise fund for independent media to promote free expression and quality journalism internationally, because citizens are losing their independent sources of information, and investigations are so critical to democratic political engagement. And we recommend that as a force for change, the United States focus specifically on women's equality and youth inclusion by creating Women's Political and Civic Leadership Initiative and launching a Young Leaders Coalition for Democracy. And finally, in this category, we recommend a much more robust strategy for supporting and protecting human rights defenders, around the globe. Next, our strategy 4. We've got to lead in developing a strategic digital policy agenda for the democratic world. The internet and digital technology can be a force that supports democracy and human rights, or alternatively, can be used to undermine liberty, security, and faith in democracy itself. The digital transformation of society has dramatically altered the context for democratic governance, and we need to understand that frame. So we need a concentrated diplomatic focus and strong US leadership to rebuild international support for a global, open, secure, and reliable internet. And our report makes suggestions in a number of categories about how to do this. First of all, elevating the strategically important dimension of this digital technology and cyber policy within our own national security policy. Second, to step up our digital technology and cyber diplomacy capabilities, first and foremost at the State Department in a variety of ways. And we need to come back to this question of partnership, rallying democratic governments around this shared vision of an open internet, a democratic approach to regulating digital technologies, and a strategic agenda for technology policy and investment. And we need to work with partners in bilateral and multilateral configurations suited to the topic and suited to our objectives. And then finally, strategy 5, we need to develop a strategy to rebuild trust in the information environment and to counter the spread of disinformation, online hate, and harassment. The spread of disinformation, state-sponsored propaganda, unintended citizen-spread misinformation, and online hate and harassment are interfering with basic democratic processes. And we propose a number of steps to deal with that. Again, and you've heard it before, we need a strategy. We propose the United States develop a whole of government strategy to address these issues, countering disinformation, online hate and harassment, and appoint a senior official on the National Security Council staff to bring agencies together to lead this effort. And then we also have a series of specific recommendations around building global societal resilience to disinformation, and online hate and harassment. And those include some important investments in programs in digital and media literacy around the world, in cybersecurity education, and in increasing engagement with like-minded democracies and companies to provide greater internet access, with a special emphasis on marginalized communities, women, and youth. And then finally, we have a diplomatic recommendation to bring like-minded governments together with social media platforms, civil society, and other parts of the private sector to work together on this problem set. Alex, over to you for the last 2.
So I'm just going to give a headline because we're going to have a fantastic panel. Our last 2 strategies are really critically important. One is about putting anti-corruption efforts and combating kleptocracy at the center of our strategy. And we've got a whole panel on that with fantastic folks, as well as harnessing the power of the United States economic statecraft and our trade agreements and our development finance to put democracy more at the center of those. I know we're out of time now, can't go into the specific recommendations, but I strongly urge everybody to stay tuned. We have a full panel discussion on that and some really interesting recommendations.
Thank you, Alex. This is Mike here again. Thank you for that excellent overview of our report, which is quite detailed. So you did a pretty good job, I would say, in 15 short minutes. Next, I'm very pleased to introduce our partner, Ambassador Josette Sheeran, the founding trustee and the executive chair of the McCain Institute, who is going to close this part of our discussion before we move on to the afternoon's conversation with some of our distinguished task force members. Josette, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you, Mike, and hello, everyone. And I'm so glad we're gathered around this virtual table here to discuss what is a critical issue, but really to launch what I think will be a game-changing report and action plan. Mike, I just have to say, I want to thank you and Freedom House. You've really been transformative in documenting and measuring the health of democracy and freedom around the world. It was vital reading for me in all my public roles at State Department and the White House and the UN, and to this day. And they're always ahead of the curve and an early warning system and a clarion call, so thank you. And I have to mention Dr. Hamre and the team from CSIS, your work is extraordinary. One example is John's podcast, The Engine Room of Democracy. I love it. It really gets into the nitty gritty hard work, and the champions are trying to build democracy in the institutions and throughout all the infrastructure that's necessary to have a healthy democracy we can all be proud of. I also want to thank Paul Fagan, who represents the McCain Institute on the task force, for his great work on this. As you heard from Cindy, she and Senator McCain long ago jumped into the arena on the front lines to fight and build for democracy at home and abroad. They have the battle scars, but also the confirmation of living for a cause much bigger than their own lives. And as Cindy said, Senator McCain never shrank from the hard battle. And I was just reminded today, as everyone was speaking, of his quote, "Americans never quit, we never surrender, we never hide from history, we make history." And I've always said in my roles in government, if we want to lead, we have to bend the arc of history toward freedom. And often that's a hard choice, because I think there's a natural instinct among many leaders to want to control and to want to control the ideas and the operations and the functions of government. But this bold American experiment is something worth fighting for, and something that has brought prosperity and innovation and ideas that have transformed the face of public health and education throughout the world, farming and agriculture and engineering. This is something worth fighting for. To succeed, we have to be all in. We have to think bold and big and act with principle and conviction and resources. And we have to walk the talk of our values. And I think this report really is the right report for this moment. It's filled with very practical, bipartisan vision and action plans, as we've heard today, but I've read every word of it. Every word's meaningful. It also introduces, I think, some important new ideas. I just want to touch briefly on the things that I haven't heard laid out the way they are in this report. First of all, the comprehensive approach from diplomacy to economics and trade, elections, internet technology, institution building, development aid, and then embedding those with bold action plans that are doable and achievable. It explores underexplored areas, one that Alex has championed and he mentioned today, such as walking our talk in development aid. And when I headed the UN World Food Program, I saw the power of activating. We had more than 10,000 women advising us at the village level all over the world. They can unlock keys to have more effective, efficient aid, but also to reduce dependency on aid. And I think allowing them to be part of that process, I've seen from Afghanistan, throughout Africa and Latin America and everywhere, often it's the first time their opinion has ever been sought, but that taste of being part of decision-making, of owning the future of their lives and their village and their country, it's really something that they never forget. And that empowerment is something that I think is very powerfully taught through the way we do aid. And I think those ideas are important. Also, a third point I want to make is at the McCain Institute, we've been deeply concerned about the handshake between generations, the passion for freedom and leadership in democracy, making sure that the champions are coming forward. And I think the report really speaks powerfully to the places where the front lines of that battle, on social media, on the dark web, on the internet, and really activating the new champions that are stepping forward in countries all over the world to fight this battle. And fourth, but not last, as Cindy said, our own house has to be in order. And there's things we're not proud of, we need to do better. But I know we're all committed to the kind of ideas in the report where we don't shy away from the profound challenges we have, and I commend the report for that. So I think this is a blueprint for action. I want to thank everyone, and I want to remind everyone of one more John McCain quote, which he said, "Be a pain in the ass for the cause and values worth fighting for." So go forth. Let's be a pain in the ass for democracy and freedom. and fighting this cause. And again, thank you. We're really proud at the McCain Institute to be part of this task force and this blueprint for action.
Thank you, Josette. Thank you, Ambassador Sharon. We really appreciate those cogent remarks. We are now going to, and your support for the work that we've done. We're now going to move to the next section of our event, which is called A Conversation with the Task Force. We're going to enter into a series of relatively short panels in which you'll hear from a number of our task force members to further unpack some of the key ideas in the task force report. Our first panel, which I will moderate, is called Challenges Ahead, Countering Authoritarianism and the Future of Democracy. Joining me are two of our distinguished task force members, Ambassador Tom Shannon and Professor Jima Bowati. Hoping they're here, yes. Dr. Jima Bowati joins us today from Accra, Ghana. He's the co-founder and board chair of Afrobarometer, emeritus professor of political science at the University of Ghana in Legon. Ambassador Shannon is senior international policy advisor at the law firm Arnold & Porter. He's a former undersecretary of state for political affairs with 35 years of service at the Department of State, holding the personal rank of career ambassador. And my task force co-chair, Alex, also joins us again. There you go. Let's go right into the questions. My first question to our panel is this. Help us frame up and understand this moment in time with respect to rising authoritarianism and steady backsliding of democracy, and why it matters so much from your perspective, from our perspective. And I'm going to turn first to Ambassador Shannon.
Thank you very much, Anne. It's a great pleasure to be with you and Alex and Dr. Jima Bowati. Truly distinguished work by this task force and a very important report at a crucial and important moment. And you framed the issue well. What is happening and why is it happening? There are many explanations, obviously, but the profound changes taking place in the world today, from globalization to technological change to the confusion and confounding nature of global governance today is a deep and abiding reality that we all have to deal with. And as we look deeper into the future, it's evident that changing global politics and the rise of nations that are authoritarian in their government and in their governmental structures highlights the fact that democracy is no longer the only option on the field. And increasingly, countries, peoples, and societies are looking at forms of government, not only in terms of values and processes, but also in terms of outcomes. And in many ways, the important aspect of this task force report is noting that democracy is more than principles, it's more than values, it's more than processes, it's about outcomes, and it's about ensuring outcomes that people believe they have played a role in identifying and moving forward. And you earlier talked about democratic societies. This is really what we're after. We're after democratic forms of government that can create democratic societies, where people not only have a voice in determining their national destiny, but a voice in determining their individual destiny. And this is what will connect the United States broadly to large parts of the world that want to drive forward individual self-development while they address national development. And this is why the importance of societies and the cultures within those societies become so important. And this is really where the fight for democracy and the effort to reverse authoritarianism is going to take place.
Thank you. Dr. Jima Bowati, a perspective from Africa.
I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Great. Well, I mean, first of all, on the face of it, it will look like democracy is on the wane across the African continent, as it is in other regions of the world. Election quality has been declining. Democratically elected presidents in about 4 countries have breached term limit provisions of their constitutions, and one, third term in the past 2 years alone. Opposition party activists and activities are increasingly being criminalized or at least circumscribed. You have rising incidents of government clampdowns on media houses, criminalization of online activism and the like. There are also disturbing signs of stagnation and regression in recent years in those countries in Africa that have been widely regarded as some of the continent's best democratic performers. And of course, China and other new global powers are vigorously courting African leadership by providing them with development finance and other assistance without political reform, and particularly by pushing an alternative, non-democratic, but ostensibly superior democratic model. But I just want to assert that the picture is quite different when you move away from the supply side, that is the side of governments and political elites failing to deliver democratic governance and clawing back past gains. If you move away from that to look at the media, social media across the continent, you look at the increasing presence of a large pool of courageous actors from all walks of life on the continent. You look at ordinary citizens taking to the streets, journalists, activists, opposition leaders, and even government officials that are pushing back against counter-democracy developments. Then you know that there is hope, there is a future for African democracy, and that, in my view, this represents a really good opportunity for the United States and other Western democratic nations to work with democratic forces and interests within the state and non-state sectors in Africa, as they would have to do elsewhere.
Thank you. I think that's a helpful and very, a broad perspective. Alex, do you have anything to add to this, or shall we go on to the next series of questions for our panelists?
Let me just emphasize this point that Professor Jima made at the very end. You know, I, like everybody, many on this task force have worked around the world on democracy in places like Afghanistan and Pakistan, in Southeast Asia, in Africa. And it is incredibly important for us to remember that the hunger for democracy is real around the world, and that so many people in the most difficult environments are repeatedly willing to risk their own lives to stand up for their rights, not because they think they're going to get rich of it or that they're going to get in power, but because they believe that it is their right to have a say in who governs them and to hold those who govern accountable. And I have seen it in places where there are bullets one day and voting the next. And we can never forget that those are the people who are fighting on the front lines, and they're the ones who will continue to need our support. We cannot leave that playing field because they are the ones doing the work. We need to support them. It's not our lead, but it's critical that we remain there for that support because others don't want them to be there.
Alex, thank you for underscoring that important point from the professor, and also I think we heard that from Ambassador Shannon. We have so much to talk about, but we have a lot to talk about. So let's use what you've just said, Alex, as a segue to a kind of bottom line question, which is for all of our panelists. What for you is the main call to action in the report? What's important here? And I want to bucket that or package it with a question about your observations and about how America's own democracy challenges may impact our global leadership and how we should see our role and our approach to the world in supporting democracy globally as we think about your views on what we should be doing here, drawing on the report. And Alex, I'm going to turn to you to answer this question first. Then I'm going to turn to to Professor Jima Bawadi, and then we'll close with Ambassador Shannon.
Well, I think that what's so important and how we've tried to structure this report and the conversations that we engaged in, we brought together a group of people, these incredible task force members, as well as a very broad group of people that we consulted with, who not only think about democracy, which is important, but who know how to get things done, who know how to think about what it means to have big ideas and then translate them into action. And what we need now is action. We need the United States government, we need the Congress, we need those that support democracy, including the business community and others. And we need our allies to step up and say, this is a critically important issue for our future. And we are not just going to worry about it and wring hands, we are actually going to take action. And so what I want people to take away from this is these points that people have been making, why we need a strategy. It's not just about recognizing the problem, that's great, and a lot of people are doing that much more eloquently than us. It's about translating that recognition into practical steps that we need to take to be out there. But it also means doing so humbly. The United States is only going to be able to be a leader in this space if it does so with others, and that it comes as a general, as a partner working in solidarity with all of those movements out there that ultimately have to carry the heavy load. We don't do it because we're right or because we're better. We do it because it's important for our partners and it's important for us.
Thank you. Alex, Professor?
Well, first, we have to remember that even though the African democracy projects of the 1990s and 2000s were largely homegrown, US, G7, and Western democratic nations support and solidarity were hugely crucial to the consolidation of these new democracies, and especially their protection from backsliding. And so the destruction of the US and Western nations' attention away from African democratic governance issues and increasingly in favor of combating violent extremism and other geopolitical threats has simply deprived the African democratization projects of vital oxygen, of needed material and moral support. Worse still, for Africa, the challenges the US and other advanced democracies have been facing with their own democracy in their own countries in recent years, including the sordid events that took place on January 6th in Washington, DC, have presented precious gifts to African authoritarians, autocrats, and their allies. In fact, they have been a real propaganda bonanza for them. So for these reasons alone, it will really be great to see the United States come back as a force for the good of democracy and accountable governance in Africa and elsewhere in the world.
Thank you. That is a compelling call to action. And the last word to Tom Shannon.
Thank you, Ann. I think what both Alex and Dr. Giamabboati have said is that what the United States says and does matters. And after 35 years as an American diplomat, I can tell you that even in our darkest times, even in our most difficult moments, how we solve problems and how we solve them within a democratic framework becomes a source of inspiration. And Alex said an important word, which was solidarity. We really need to fashion an approach which is not didactic. It's about accompaniment. It's about solidarity. It's about working together. But as we do so, as we elevate democracy within US national security strategy and policy, as we integrate it across our agencies, it's important, I think, to recognize and understand that as we promote a way of being and a way of life, this is all about how we keep ourselves relevant and meaningful in the world today. The United States has never been a status quo power. We have always been a power that has been able to adapt and respond to the changes that are taking place in the world and to drive those changes and to shape them as we see fit, not only to match our interests, but also our values. And I believe strongly that what this focus on democracy will do is ensure that we are connecting to the vast number of people around the world who are desperate, as I mentioned earlier, to have a say not only in their national destiny, but in their individual destiny, and to be able to realize their full realization as human beings, what our founding fathers called pursuit of happiness. And I think that in this regard, for the United States to stay relevant, to stay meaningful, and to stay ahead of the curve, we have to commit ourselves to democracy. We have to begin to implement what this report underscores.
Thank you. And thank you all for this panel and beyond that for your partnership in this undertaking.
Thank you too.
It was a great honor.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So thank you all. Thank you, Anne, for moderating a great conversation. I should have mentioned, by the way, in introducing my friend Alex, that in addition to being the co-director of this task force, working pretty much, full time with Anne for the last 6 months, he's also started a new job on another small issue. Is that he's the CEO of the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery. So we wish him the best on that new endeavor and have appreciated his partnership with this project. So we're next going to turn to Todd Lindbergh, who is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and who's also a member of our task force. He's going to moderate a conversation on the architecture and alliances for supporting democracy, which is a vital part of the equation here. And he is going to be joined by David Kramer, one of my predecessors as president of Freedom House, who is now senior fellow in the Václav Havel Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy and director for European and Eurasian Studies at the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs at Florida International University. And also Ambassador Sarah Mendelson, who is a distinguished service professor of public policy and the head of the Heinz College in Washington, D.C. for Carnegie Mellon University. Todd, over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Mike. And thanks to Freedom House, CSIS, McCain Institute for convening this. I must say, when we first talked about this and then the thought that you could put something like this together in 6 months was one about which I was skeptical. I congratulate especially Anne and Alex for holding this together and getting the job done. Just an extraordinary achievement. Our task is just in as few minutes as possible to run through some of what we think are the kind of highlights of the sections in particular that Sarah and David worked on. And I'm going to start with Sarah. One of the things that I think that is quite interesting is the convergence of the Biden administration's interest in convening a summit of democracies and some of the themes that emerge from this report. How about if you say a few words? What should we expect from a summit of democracies?
Sure. First, let me just thank everybody who was involved, particularly the working group members who helped me think through the Summit for Democracy and what it ought to look like. And just to acknowledge that there are lots of colleagues who are joining us who spent 25, 30 years working on these issues around the world. I think, Todd, really what we're trying to do is take the moment and say, what is new here? The idea of a Summit for Democracy is to recognize that we are in a moment that is going to require a generational change. So first, what's new is looking at the link between what happens in the United States and what happens internationally, and understanding that we're not the only democracy that is in trouble and having trouble delivering to our citizens. We need to make sure our house is in order. That domestic reform agenda needs to be part of whatever Summit for Democracy happens. But two, we need much greater collaboration, joint action with our fellow democracies on pushing back against authoritarianism, whether it's about disinformation, very specific actions around combating corruption, making sure our own institutions are not used by authoritarians. And if we can do that jointly, it's going to be much stronger collectively, whether it's North America together with Europe, together with democracies in other parts of the world. The third is thinking about new strategies for human rights defenders, some of whom are living in exile, whether or not we need a joint solidarity fund, maybe publicly and privately funded. And then, of course, not forgetting that there are fragile democracies that need to be supported. So it's a comprehensive agenda. Some people think it's why should we be doing this now? I don't think there is a plan B. I think we have to do it. I think the Biden administration is right to be thinking about it. But it needs to be done in a very consultative way, not just heads of government coming, but consultations in the United States with civil society, encouraging our allies to do the same, and then having a combination of, much like the Open Government Partnership does, of governments, but also citizens, civil society coming together at such a summit.
I think one of the things that's really emerged recently is in the development community, human rights, et cetera, is that the top-down approaches don't work very effectively, if they work at all. That what is really essential is getting people together at the local level and getting their views on how to proceed. This has come up before in the course of our discussions today, but there is some might ask, well, some do ask, who are we to be doing this now? And so let me just put that question to you, Sarah, and then I'll come to David with the same question. Who are we to put this to raise these issues now?
Indeed, there's an entire cottage industry that has grown up around this question. I want to say that we also have a framework that we collectively as a international community have agreed to, which is around the Sustainable Development Goals. That framework applies domestically and internationally. It recognizes that development happens everywhere. It's extremely relevant for the moment that we're in, the pandemic and post-pandemic era that we're hopefully moving into. And it recognizes that sustainability is about creating peaceful, just, and inclusive communities, not just about the climate crisis, although it also touches on that. Democracies delivering and pushing back on authoritarianism is in US national security interests, but it's also in the interests of all of our allies. So collectively, we need to be doing it, but I would suggest we need to be doing it in a different way, and the SDGs provide a framework. We have to be clear about addressing our own issues and reducing inequities. Addressing the legacy of slavery in this country is going to be absolutely critical, but that's what democracies do. They can course correct, unlike brittle or fragile authoritarian regimes. And so I say, let's get to it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sarah. Over to you, David. You can start with that question, but I also want to hear from you about what these fundamentals of democracy are and what we need to be doing to protect them.
Thanks very much. And my thanks to Freedom House and McCain Institute and CSIS. I think I'm the only member of the task force that has worked at all three organizations, but it shows I can't hold on to a job. But I'm thrilled to be here, and congratulations to Ann and Alex for just doing a heroic job in getting this report done and out. The issue about, who are we to be a voice in this cause? We should always take a dose of humility when we approach this subject and recognize that we are not perfect. Perhaps we should add an extra dose in light of some recent developments in the United States. But we have never pretended to be perfect. And what we are trying to do is to show that we can grow and we can learn from our mistakes, and we have corrective measures in place. And so actually by correcting our mistakes and making up for our shortcomings, that in itself can be a model for other countries. At the same time, as even in our darkest times, there are people around the world who look to the United States and other democracies for assistance, whether it's rhetorical, whether it's financial, whether it's political, whatever the case may be. They need the United States to play a key role in this cause. And the word solidarity has come up a number of times throughout this conversation. That's really important. It can't just be the United States. We're also not looking to impose ourselves on others. What we are trying to do is to give others the opportunity to exercise their fundamental universal rights to live in a democratic, free society. That's what this is about. And I don't think there's anyone around the world, from North Korea to Venezuela to Cuba, you name it, who would rather live under an authoritarian regime than under a democratic system. That democracies are not perfect, but they're better than all the other systems.
And indeed, even among people who've been most critical of practices in the United States, I don't detect a strong affinity for substituting, say, one-party rule. Nobody thinks the solution to our problem is Xi Jinping. So we've got that going for us. Now, how do we take that basic normative structure out on the road, David?
Yeah, just to build on that point, Todd, I mean, you don't see a lot of people fleeing their homeland to go to China or to Russia. A lot of people do look to come to the United States, yes, for economic opportunities for sure, but also the opportunity to live in a free society. And I think that's why we see so many immigrants in this country who want to give back to this country. And that's why I think being a welcoming society is so important and in US interest. Democracies are pretty fragile, as we've discovered with the rollback in a number of countries around the world, documented in Freedom House's Freedom in the World report. the fundamental features, just very quickly, are free and fair elections, independent institutions with checks and balances, rule of law, protection of human rights, accountability for those who are in government, a diverse and independent media, and a vibrant civil society. And we are seeing all of those under attack in various parts around the world. And so we need to do a better job of fixing our own problems. So there is an internal challenge that we face. There's also the external challenge that we face. And the external comes principally from Russia and China, not only, but they are the main authoritarian threats to the democratic way of life. And in the report, we actually have a recommendation saying that we need to do a better, more effective job in pushing back on these authoritarian threats. Rather than just being reactive, we need to be more preemptive and more public in pushing back against these threats that we face.
That's great. Sarah, let me turn to you. Let me just ask you, you ran one of the working groups on this report. Are there some key findings and recommendations that you want to highlight from the area that you worked on?
Yes, I think that there's a sense that we actually need to widen the aperture in how we think about both democracy promotion, but the way in which we do it. By that, I mean really specifically having much more demand-driven responses rather than supply side. If you think about how we fund these things, Congress appropriates, goes through state and aid, goes to NGOs. The gold standard in, not always met, but the gold standard in development is that it's data-driven, it's human-centered design, you're listening and responding to people and what they need. This needs to happen in this country, but elsewhere. And a much greater focus on socioeconomic issues, really understanding we're living obviously in a global pandemic, but addressing inequities, understand this concept of sustainability in a lot of ways is looking around corners and understanding that there can be political repercussions for public policy choices that on the face of it, for example, are about infrastructure, but then have a completely different effect on different kinds of communities. So it's really about having a much more granular understanding of who it is that you're working with, rather than supplying only institutions, but trying to understand what their needs are and meeting those needs. And I think to the extent that we can, as a community, grow muscle memory in having a greater focus on data and on local voice, it's going to be to the benefit of everyone.
Great. David, let me turn to you and just basically put the same question. In this working group that you ran, what are some of the key things that haven't really come up yet and that you want to emphasize?
Let me just first say, Todd, that the way a government and regime treats its own people is often indicative of how it will behave in foreign policy. So we shouldn't be shocked when the Putin regime tries to rig an election in Russia and then tries to interfere in elections in the United States. We shouldn't be shocked when China tries to censor its own people and then tries to censor any criticism beyond China's borders. And we shouldn't be shocked when these regimes and their leaders steal money from their own people, but then try to put it in a safe place in Western institutions. So we need to do a better job of keeping a guard up on these threats that are coming. Anne had mentioned earlier the key points that we've made are Center for Integrity of Elections, again, with some humility, given what we went through here with efforts to discredit the US election, a focus on supporting independent and diverse media, which is a critical element to any democracy, inclusion with a particular emphasis on women, who are half the population, but not half of the political activity around the world, as well as youth. And then also a beefing up of support for human rights defenders, for activists, for lawyers. They need help. In some cases, they are literally putting their lives on the line. And the least we can do is to provide some assistance so that they can keep doing what they want to do.
Let me also ask, David, do you see a geopolitical dimension to this challenge? It's not merely a human rights and civil and political liberties question. And I'll put the same question to you, Sarah, in just a moment.
Yes, I do. Look, if China were democratic, we would have disagreements and we wouldn't always be in agreement with China, but we could manage those. We have disagreements with our fellow democratic allies. The problem with China is that it is an authoritarian regime that looks to expand its influence in threatening ways. And that's where we run into the problem. The same with the Putin regime, which is an authoritarian regime. A democratic Russia, we would undoubtedly have some differences and disagreements with. I'm willing to explore those, but I know for a fact that we will never really be able to have a true partnership with a Russia that is under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, because we don't have much in common when it comes to interest, and we have nothing in common when it comes to values. Mr. Putin doesn't value democracy, he doesn't value human rights. Instead, he runs in a corrupt, kleptocratic, authoritarian system, and that poses a threat, first to his own people, second to his neighbors, and third to us here in the United States.
Yeah, over to you, Sarah.
I certainly agree with everything that David said. I just add that we actually have a playbook that we can use around sustainable development that we negotiated, that people agreed to, that is very critically has elements of democracy and human rights, fighting corruption, reducing violence, all embedded in it. We don't have to make this up, it's already there. If we work more collaboratively with our allies to advance this, and I might add, at this point, we're the only OECD country, the only G20 country that hasn't come out with any kind of voluntary review. There's lots of action happening in the US in cities, Pittsburgh, New York City, the state of Hawaii, California, Orlando, but we need to up our game, and we need to be collaborating with our allies to make clear what this agenda is, because frankly, China is running around the world with the Belt and Road Initiative and in acting as if it's a value-free initiative when it's not. And we've got this SDG agenda that we can advance that is it's a blueprint, and it can help us. It's a path for action.
You mentioned something that mostly the conversation we've been having so far today has focused on state action, the government of the United States, the government of China, for that matter, also the very personalized government of Russia. But what can people do? What do we, as not merely citizens of states, but actually as actors in our own right, what can we contribute to this process?
I think it's actually critical, whatever community you're in, we should be figuring out what is the way to roll up this domestic reform agenda and inform the White House. I work in a university. This is a conversation I'm having with my students, with my colleagues, in Pittsburgh with other colleagues. I think it's absolutely vital. We mentioned civic education earlier today. We've got to get back to a sense of the stakes are very high. Everybody needs to have a role in this. This isn't something that other people do. We're all doing this. The real trick is, how do you then make clear and crystallize what that agenda is and help shape this agenda, the summit? We know how to do a summit as diplomats. We're much less adept at consulting our own populations and rolling that up. And I think that this is a renewed effort at democracy to be able to do that.
Great.
So Todd, if I could just jump in on that. Look, what people can do is hold their officials accountable. And you can't do that in an authoritarian system. In fact, the very nature of an authoritarian system is to deny citizens accountability for their actions. Representative democracies have people hold positions of public trust. And if they don't do their job, they can be voted out in elections. If they commit a crime or violate the public trust, they could be held accountable through other measures. So accountability is the way for citizens to hold their officials responsible. It also means participation. It's critical that people participate in the political process, in the civic process. It doesn't have to be by running for office. It could be running for a local city council. It could be anything. It could be being a journalist. It could be being on a university board or any other board. Accountability is the difference, I think, one of the main differences between democracies and authoritarian systems. Authoritarian systems try to prevent any sense of accountability whatsoever. And the more we can hold people accountable, including if we have to, by imposing sanctions or other costs for gross human rights abuses, that to me is a way to try to bring some sense of justice and accountability when some countries actually lack that.
Thanks, David. That's great. You know, when there's a gap, as there is, between your practice and what your norms say you should do, you got two choices. You can chuck your norms and adjust your values to your practice, or you can keep your norms and try to bring your practice more into conformity. The temptation, I think, is the authoritarian temptation. Certainly, is the former. Let's just let's be realistic. Let's talk about how things really are in the world, as our Russian friends often say. But no, I don't think so. I think the normative agenda is genuine. I think it's widely shared. I think it's worth defending. I wrote a little piece on this report, which is on AmericanPurpose.com, which I'll plug, and then turn over to Mike again. Thanks very much. Thanks, David. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Todd, David, and Sarah. Good friends all, great conversation. And now we're going to turn to a really important topic that's part of this task force report, which is the issue of technology and democracy, which we at Freedom House really see firsthand the kind of impact that is playing in the erosion of democracy and the rise of digital authoritarianism. I'm really pleased that we have Adrian Shabazz, who is our head of our technology and democracy efforts at Freedom House, who's going to moderate the next panel. He will be joined by two members of our task force, Eileen Donahoe, who's the executive director of the Global Digital Policy Incubator at Stanford University, part of the FSI Cyber Policy Center, and also Vera Zachem, a senior director and policy advisor for the Institute for Security and Technology and the founder of Zachem Global Strategies. Adrian, please take over.
Thank you so much, Mike, and welcome everybody to the technology portion of this fantastic rollout. Just a massive congrats to Eileen and Vera for this fantastic strategy and the detailed recommendations that are available in the report. I'm certainly biased. I'm the director for tech and democracy, so I think that this is really, in many ways, the issue of the day. And I'm just going to jump right in because I know that our time is limited and there are so many fascinating parts of this. So I'll start with you, Eileen, if I may. If you could just start off by laying out, why does technology matter to the goal of strengthening democracy and countering authoritarianism today?
So this chapter on technology is essentially a plea for renewed US leadership, but specifically in the context of the digital transformation of society. On the question of why tech matters so much to our mission, the key point is that the digital revolution we've experienced has dramatically altered the context for democratic governance. Digital society is the context in which democracies must perform and democracy must be practiced. Digitization has infiltrated every sector of society, and while it has certainly brought many benefits, and I don't want to undercut that, it also has created all kinds of new security vulnerabilities for citizens, organization, government, from everything, confidential communications, personal data, connected infrastructure. Everything is now vulnerable in new ways. And democracies are struggling to protect the liberty and security of citizens, as well as economic and national security in this dramatically changed context. I will say a decade ago, when Freedom House first, a little more started Freedom on the Net, we were at the height of the internet freedom movement. And at that time, the US was really at the forefront of tech advocacy. We assumed that the internet and digital technologies were inherently liberating forces and that authoritarians would never catch up. This was obviously very naive, and authoritarians have caught up and now utilize digital tools very effectively, not only for repression and to solidify control at home, but to extend their authoritarian influence abroad through export of infrastructure and other repressive tools for surveillance and censorship. I will also say digital tools have become the weapons of choice against democracy. They're used to undermine the integrity of elections, to spread propaganda and disinformation about democracies. But last point, and probably the most important, is the digital authoritarian challenge is very substantial, but it's not the whole story.
Digitization of everything has been a challenge within democracies, independent of malign influences. And a core problem is that democracies haven't figured out how to adhere to democratic values and international human rights principles in their own use and regulation of tech. And these failures have created tension among democracies, and our divisions over tech policy are actually weakening the democratic alliance. So that's the context.
Well, what context that is, I think that's perhaps the best summary that I've heard of 10 years of Freedom on the Net report. So thank you so much for that. And I think that you've outlined really the daunting task at hand for the US government in confronting many of the issues that you laid out. So what are some of the key recommendations around harnessing digital technology and setting strong democratic norms that are laid out in your report?
So the top line recommendation is for the US to lead the democratic world to a compelling vision of democratic digital society and a shared strategic tech policy and investment agenda. And we need this to be more attractive than what's being offered by the digital authoritarian model. As a first step, as with many others, we do recommend that the US get our own house in order by figuring out how to role model adherence to democratic values in the domestic use and regulation of technology, and by dramatically stepping up US tech and cyber diplomacy. And then second, we strongly recommend that the Biden administration finds a way to heal the transatlantic rift over data and tech regulation. The first step here is obviously to find an alternative to the Privacy Shield arrangement that was struck down last summer by the European Court of Justice. It was negotiated during the end of the Obama era. And we cannot really expect the US to rally the rest of the democratic world together around a shared vision if we can't overcome our tensions with Europe. Then, like many others, we suggest using the Summit for Democracy to jumpstart the process of developing this larger democratic vision. Obviously, there will be many competing priorities at the summit, but we do believe the tech agenda must be a focal point. And I will just quickly mention the 4 core elements and themes that we think must be developed at the summit include elevating protection of the open, reliable, secure internet. And what is that? What is a realistic version of that? And how to protect human rights in a digital context. Leading in the development of a shared democratic approach to use and regulation of technology that is consistent with international human rights law. A comprehensive plan to counter the spread of digital authoritarianism, and in particular, the trend towards cyber sovereignty. And last but not least is to build a strategic tech investment agenda for democracies to do together.
There's really so much there and a wealth of detailed recommendations, and I highly recommend that everyone goes to the website to read the report in full. I want to turn to you, Vera, about the information environment. This is a core part of a lot of the key issues around digital technology that democratic societies are having today. So how did you confront this issue around, the role that the information environment plays in supporting democracy and also in countering authoritarianism?
So first of all, I do have to say a huge thank you, 1 to 3 institutions. Of course, absolute pleasure to work with Eileen, as always, who is one of the biggest leaders in this field. Obviously to Ann and Alex, to you, Adrian, who provided us so much invaluable insights throughout this process, and to all of the working group members and policymakers and industry leaders and civil society leaders that we were able to consult with. So to start off to what you said, and kind of to piggyback into what Eileen said, 15 years, for example, when we were thinking about how information travels, information proliferates, the one thing that was glaringly missing is social media. When social media, the onset of social media, has developed became sort of part of our information environment, it fundamentally has changed how we perceive information, how we receive information, and both for the bad and the good. I think about Arab Spring, when social media allowed us to see protests and the organization of people for the greater common good, for democracy, and for freedom. And then also some of the not so great things that we have seen, including disinformation, as well as online hate and harassment. So I think that in itself has changed. But also, by the way, when we think about the information environment and now coming to 2021, it is not just social media. It is also about mainstream media. It is about different channels, the way the information proliferates. The one thing at the offset I do want to say, and which is unique and different, and we can certainly see this in even this shift in the last 4 years, it's not just about state-sponsored propaganda by authoritarian regimes, intentional disinformation by both state actors like Russia and China, but non-state actors and individual actors that we have seen certainly in the United States and around the world, but also the rampant online hate and harassment towards marginalized communities that we have seen in the United States and around the world. And we've also seen how much this actually intrinsically linked to disinformation campaigns, both online and off. And in the context of democracy, in how the information environment has proliferated, that is part of the reason we included in our report.
Thank you for that comprehensive laying out of the issues. I mean, in everything that you've seen then, whether it's countering disinformation or addressing online hate and harassment, what is a realistic and an effective approach that you believe the US government could take moving forward?
Oh, absolutely. So in the report, we outline 3 big recommendations that kind of ground the strategy. One is we have yet to have a holistic strategy, a US government holistic strategies that pulls all instruments of national power to counter these ills. And this is one of the things that we propose. We propose a senior official at the National Security Council to coordinate it and implement it. And oh, by the way, also work very closely with private sector and civil society. That's a start. I think understanding the impact of these threats and understanding the impact of US government response to address these challenges is also important. One of the things that we really try to elevate in this report is the importance of resilience. One way to really critically counter these ills, I'm going to say plural, is really strengthening societal resilience in democratic countries and inspiring societies as well. And that is everything from digital literacy to media literacy, including things like two-factor authentication, but also increasing internet access and strengthening the capability of emerging technologies to assist and help in these endeavors. And the one interesting idea that we as a task force came up with is really, and kind of partner with what Eileen had mentioned, also really elevating the diplomacy around these sets of issues, which is so critical. What we're proposing here is a global task force on countering or strengthening the information integrity and resilience, one that is a true public-private civic partnership with strong participation with civil society and private sector, but one that is led by the US government in partnership and perhaps on rotational leadership responsibilities with other like-minded countries, including those from the global South. We think that might be a really bold step, one that could be introduced in the Summit for Democracies to, one, coordinate on information sharing, on lessons learned about resiliency, and really addressing the online hate and harassment.
Thank you so much, Vera. I want to turn back to you, Eileen. Vera, you mentioned cyber diplomacy and the importance of that. Eileen, I wondered if you could tease out some of the details around how the U.S. government should bolster its own cyber diplomacy, internally, and also your thoughts on whether what is that role of coordination among democracies?
So, coordination among democracies is essential for the simple reason that we are in a geopolitical battle over the dominant model for governance of 21st century digital society. So we must band together. And if we allow tensions to fester, we will only be reinforcing the authoritarian narrative that democracy is no longer an effective form of government, and we will participate in the erosion of confidence in the international human rights system. We don't need homogeneity in our regulatory approach. We do need harmony and legal interoperability. And we also need to band together on our strategic tech investments and planning. If we do not win the tech battle as well as the values battle, we will not be supporting democracy. China understands this well. All forms of power will flow from dominance in technology, military, economic, geopolitical, diplomatic. We have to do both technology and values. And then on the cyber diplomacy, show up everywhere. Anywhere technology policy, cyber norms are discussed, multilateral, multi-stakeholder, bilateral, it's got to be raised as a much bigger strategic priority.
Fantastic. Vera, with some of the time that we have left, I wanted to take advantage just to ask you a little bit more. You had gone through the three components of the strategy on disinformation. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the importance of building local resilience, particularly in countries that might not be democracies, that are rapidly coming online, where civil society might be very vulnerable to things like hate and harassment, not to mention disinformation and smear campaigns. How do you see that the role of building local resilience as part of this broader strategy on supporting democratic movements?
Absolutely. And I think it is really one of the very best things that we can do in supporting democracies around the world, including the ones that you mentioned, Adrian. I think one of the things that we need to do is really empower local voices on the ground, local authoritative figures on the ground, to really provide them with the tools. So that's why things like, whether it's new media organizations or children and adults, when we talk about cyber hygiene or cyber education, those are all important, and ensure that people have access to technology, which is absolutely critical as well. And those are the kind of the things that we highlight in the report. And this is also part of the thing, what we're also highlighting is really elevating the role of U.S. Agency for National Development in working with partner governments and working with civil society and the private sector to really deliver on these promises.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Eileen and Vera. We are just like that. We're running out of time. I'll pass it over back to Mike. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian, and thank you, Vera and Eileen, for a really terrific panel. It's always wonderful to see the three of you guys talk tech, so thank you for that. All right, we're going to have a great final panel, and so for those hundreds of people who are still on this virtual meeting, your patience will be rewarded because we have a real all-star panel. So I'm going to first introduce you to the newest member of Freedom House's executive team, Nicole Bibbins-Sadaka, who has been part of this task force and has been serving as a deputy director of and a professor in the Georgetown University Master of Science in Foreign Service program, is going to moderate our final panel of the day on the role of economic statecraft in supporting democracy and countering corruption. And we're really pleased that Nicole is going to start at Freedom House in a few weeks as our new executive vice president for strategy. Welcome, Nicole, to Freedom House. She is going to be joined today by three big experts. One is Stuart Levy, who's a former Undersecretary of Treasury for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. Mike Green, who is a Senior Vice President for Asia and the Japan Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, who also is Professor and Director of Asian Studies at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. And also Rory McFarker, the former Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Global Economics and Finance at the National Security Council. We're thrilled to have the three of you with us today. Nicole, please take over.
Thank you so much, Mike. I'm really delighted to be here and delighted to be joined by three true experts on the issue of economic statecraft. I'm looking forward to our conversation. Let me start with asking you, Stuart. The recommendations look at economic statecraft for a number of purposes, but including to counter corruption. Can you just walk us through why it was so important to highlight corruption and really elevate that as a key component as we're thinking about how to counter authoritarianism and expand democracy and freedom globally?
Okay, well, thank you, Nicole, and let me echo all the thank yous that other panelists have made earlier in the program. It may not be obvious to everybody why a task force on countering authoritarianism and promoting democracy would highlight anti-corruption, but the task force believed that this was a critical portion of our strategy, and it's something that, frankly, all the experts that we talked to agreed with. And the key reason is that corruption really is correlated with authoritarianism. I'm not really sure, maybe others are, but I'm not really sure whether corruption causes authoritarianism, but it is at least mutually reinforcing. Corruption and the ability to steal public funds and take public opportunities, they give authoritarians the incentive and the means to consolidate their power. And so we looked at this as critical, and we saw it both as that threat that I just mentioned, but it's also a tremendous opportunity if we want to counter authoritarianism. Anti-corruption is one of the most powerful tools we have at our disposal. And a simple reason for that, well, actually there are two simple reasons for that. One is that it's exactly those anti-corruption measures that authoritarians fear the most. What do they fear most? They fear rule of law. They fear accountability, they fear transparency, they fear real governance. All of those things are the things that they fear, and they're the things that democratic societies can bring, and that we can push for. And the second reason why it's an excellent tool is that we have something going for us when it comes to anti-corruption, which is that almost every country in the world at least gives lip service to the idea that they're willing to fight corruption. We have things like the UN Convention Against Corruption, which almost every country in the world signed up to, and there are other things similar to that. So we have the first step already going for us, where there is this sort of political commitment that countries are going to work together to fight corruption. And we can use that to drive action. So what we came up with as a task force is a series of recommendations that try to build on that, where we try to use that political agreement that we have already in place to drive anti-corruption measures. There are a series of them. I would just mention one very quickly that I think is particularly interesting, which is using the Financial Action Task Force, which has been very effective over the years in driving the fight against money laundering and terrorist financing and counterproliferation financing, to use the Financial Action Task Force to task them to come up with standards against anti-corruption that can be used to evaluate and monitor countries and test their progress on fighting corruption. This has been a very effective measure on those other issues, as I mentioned, and we think it's one of the things that we should do on fighting corruption.
Excellent. Thank you for that explanation, Stuart. I think we do, as you say, have a huge opportunity to really strengthen the many of the tools that we have on anti-corruption and really expand how we are working together through a whole of government approach to make progress on this issue. Mike, let me turn to you. So the report calls for the Biden administration to reframe trade and development policy to counter authoritarianism. Can you just walk us through some of the recommendations, particularly on the use of trade and development finance, what recommendations you have there? And I would love for you to also spend a minute on the women's empowerment piece. It's important that that one recommendation was elevated in the economic tradecraft section of the report.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. So Rory McFarquhar and I had a just terrific working group on this basket of issues with thought leaders from the Chamber of Commerce, labor, tech associations, national security and foreign policy experts. And, you know, it was a fantastic experience because there was much more convergence of thinking around this set of tools and objectives than you might expect. We found that in a survey we did at CSIS on China policy, which is on our website, we published last year, when we asked about human rights and democracy in different sectors, labor, Chamber of Commerce and so forth. We were struck at how much convergence there was on the importance of this. And it makes sense. The US business community, American economic policy gives us huge leverage to set rules, to use the power of our market. And so economic statecraft is a tool of our democracy strategy. But for US companies, for US access, transparent, accountable, well-governed partners are also critical. So it's a virtuous cycle. On the trade policy front, you know, the United States, are now out of the two biggest multilateral trade agreements in Asia, RCEP and TPP. The Europeans are doing things with the region. And as a broad matter of strategy, we needed a way to get back into that. And our group focused in particular on digital trade, which is an easier first step, less politically complicated in the US, and goes right to some of the issues you heard from the previous panel. About technology trade and technology competition, reciprocity, data, and so forth. There was a broad recognition from everyone in our group that we have to do a better job, being inclusive of labor and women, which I'll get to push these over the line, these trade agreements. But that democracy and democratic governance as a framing way to advance trade agreements in the US is a winner. And so that's an important point we found. Development finance also very, very important. There's a thing people refer to as the Millennium Challenge Count effect, MCC effect. When we give development finance assistance to countries that are making real efforts to improve their democratic governance, a limited amount of money goes a very, very long way by drawing in private sector investment, by drawing in other donors, multilateral donors. We now have in the US the Development Finance Corporation, a much more powerful tool than the old OPIC. And we have very strong cooperation with Japan, Australia, and others on particularly infrastructure financing, what Japan and now all of us call quality infrastructure. And here we emphasize that quality infrastructure is not just about debt sustainability and transparency, it's about quality of civil society and of parliamentary oversight and of anti-corruption. So our development finance policies with allies like Japan, Australia, increasingly Europe is in this space of infrastructure financing. We can really, advance democratic governance, accountability, and transparency, which will make our projects more attractive and sustainable. And frankly, put a lot of pressure on China's Belt and Road for them to either improve the quality or, suffer the consequences. And finally, you asked about women's empowerment. There are studies, as you know, that show up to $13 trillion could be added to global GDP by 2030 if women participate in the economy at the same rate as men. And COVID has knocked that goal back, as we know, because of the impact on women in the workforce. So our trade policies, our economic policies need to be gender inclusive, need to mainstream gender as a theme. About half of trade agreements in the world include a gender component. Studies strongly suggest that when you include women's empowerment in economic agreements, and for that matter in conflict resolution and development, the agreements last, they stick, they have more impact. So gender is a very, very important piece of both prosperity, but also the democratic governance that we're trying to achieve. So it was a great task force with a meeting of minds from very different sectors that really gave me a lot of hope that this can be a national strategy that a lot of different sectors play in.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mike. I think it really is extraordinary because the report really highlights some creative ways, but extraordinarily impactful ways to use economic statecraft, which sometimes we forget when we're thinking about that broader way that we can counter authoritarianism. Rory, let me turn to you and really dig down on two issues that your working group focused on, promoting inclusive growth and the private sector's role, because it's important that we really flag that this is not just government doing this on behalf of others, but really engaging all of the different actors within the society. So can you just explain a little bit about what the task force came up with on those two issues?
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, I'd like to, as with everyone else, thank the organizers of this fantastic task force and for driving a really impressive process and really inclusive process that has brought together this report. So specifically on the question of inclusive growth, for many, many years, the most powerful aspect of US economic policy with respect to democracy promotion was the example of US economic performance. Other countries wanted to be rich, and they saw America's wealth and America's democracy as two sides of the same coin. And that is something that has recently been somewhat tarnished. It's been tarnished in a number of respects. First of all, obviously the United States over the years, most notably with the global financial crisis that started in the United States, but more recently with COVID, we've suffered a number of economic setbacks. Second, it is, I think, evident within the United States, but also outside the United States, that there has been a divergence between our country's economic performance and the median wage over the course now of several decades. So we have ourselves, to some extent, lost the inclusiveness of our economic model. And the third challenge is that for the first time, we've really seen the emergence of an alternative political economic model in the shape of China that has really started to signal to other countries in the developing world that there may be another model. There may be a non-democratic authoritarian model of development that can succeed every bit as well as the United States. And so when we think about how to push back on that narrative, there are some obvious things that follow from that. First of all, we really need to get our domestic house in order. We need to achieve overall economic growth, but we also need to fix the non-inclusiveness of our own model. And I think that's something that this administration has embraced, both sides of that, and that really the power of our example, as President Biden likes to say, is going to be really critically important in this respect. So that's first and foremost. But again, when we think about all the other economic levers that we have at our disposal, ranging from trade agreements to development assistance to our work in the multilateral development banks and so on, making inclusiveness a central aspect of their agendas is, in other countries, is also going to be critically important, because we can't just make the old-fashioned assumption that a rising GDP is going to ultimately raise all boats. And then on your second question on the role of the private sector, and this is actually a very controversial point in some ways, because what we've seen is that on the one hand, American companies led the drive for globalization, again, over many decades. We have enormous trillions of dollars worth of investment in other countries. And in principle, I think that it was always believed that companies would bring American values with them. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that. But we also have to recognize that once American companies are invested in some of these, some other countries, they then are also subject to pressures from local governments. And we've seen that most recently in the case of China, where American companies have really, in some cases, effectively been forced to act as advocates for the Chinese authorities in the United States, which feels like a very perverse outcome. And in extreme examples, we've seen American companies bullied after expressing support for democracy and human rights. And so one thing that we recommend is that both the United States and leading US allies, that we find ways of protecting our companies from the kinds of government retaliation that a number of companies in very high profile fashion have experienced over recent years.
Excellent. I think that we hear a number of themes running through all of these different panels, particularly on the importance of engaging new and different actors at home, getting our house in order, but the simultaneity of that along with our international engagement as we do it, as we model, but also as we engage and integrate the exact things that we're working on at home into our broader foreign policy and using the tools that we have. Stuart, let me come to you to talk about engaging wider array of actors, particularly the report talks about international organizations and businesses specifically on corruption. If you can just speak a little bit to that and how we can engage those different stakeholders in this effort.
Well, sure. I think one of the things that we realize is that of course we're usually the biggest primary stakeholder, biggest donor in a lot of these multilateral organizations or international organizations. And if we, take that role very seriously, we can identify, a broad strategy that we can pursue in all of these organizations at the same time. It's not that we haven't been pursuing these issues in those organizations. It's just that we feel as a task force that we could do better at coordinating and making that, driving that strategy holistically, and making sure that in all of these organizations, we were prioritizing the issues that we've just discussed on this panel, whether it's anti-corruption or trade or inclusive growth, that if we thought about it, rather than each organization taking it on separately, if we thought about it as one strategy driven from the center, we'd have a much more effective outcome. So that's one of the recommendations that we made in the report.
Excellent, excellent. Let me turn to Rory and Mike, either one of you, on the question of China, because that's obviously a central issue. And maybe Rory, if you want to jump in, just on how do we think about China in the context of our economic statecraft and its deep importance to democracy and pushing back on authoritarianism.
Well, I mean, I think that China is going to be a preoccupation for the current administration in many domains. We obviously in this task force are, very focused on China's activities outside China, but also its human rights record in places like Xinjiang and Hong Kong. And we would advocate, and I think that this is already reflected in some of the early statements we've heard from this administration, that it should not downplay human rights in the interests of reaching a short-term trade agreement or frankly compromising on other priorities and saying that the democracy dimension of this relationship doesn't matter. In fact, I think that one thing that I would also highlight is that we've seen that in many ways we are more likely to assemble coalitions of allies with the Europeans and even some of our Asian partners around issues of democracy and human rights than around economic issues narrowly construed, simply because we have different economic interests in many cases. We won't necessarily agree on everything. We won't necessarily think that we're better off in an agreement with Europe on China than Europe might think that they're better off reaching their own agreement with China. Whereas on questions of human rights, we're definitely all on the same page.
Mm-hmm. Which gives us a great opportunity. We could continue this conversation for quite some time, but I am aware that we are trying to get through what is a really, really meaty report in a very short amount of time. So let me just wrap up our time before I hand it off to my friend and colleague, Paul, just to say thank you to you, Mike, Stuart, and Rory, a really tremendous effort to pull together a tremendously talented group of people to pull together the ideas that you've put in the report on economic statecraft. So thank you for your effort in that.
Thank you, Nicole.
Nicole.
With that, I'm going to turn to my friend Paul Fagan from the McCain Institute, and with thanks for the partnership that they have had along with CSIS with Freedom House, and just turn it over to you to wrap us up for the afternoon.
Thanks so much, Nicole. Really appreciate that. And as she said, we're old friends and colleagues, so it's great to be among so many colleagues here and to speak up to all of you today. I do want to, wrap this up in a way that I really do thank Alex and Anne for leading this effort, for the partnership from Freedom House, to our friends at CSIS, at Craig Cohen, who's a good friend and colleague. Without, the leadership of the organizations, this would not have been done. I don't want to take too much time about the report highlighting everything because, our panelists did such an excellent job, but I would say and reiterate, this is an incredible journey and an incredible group of people who represent people from the national security establishment, human rights, development. So you're seeing, a combination of people that I would say probably haven't come together before to talk about these issues and to create a strategy that focuses on a strategy that's very holistic. I am from the McCain Institute, and I would be remiss if I did not quote John McCain as we try to continue his legacy on these issues. One thing that he wrote a few years ago in the New York Times in an opinion piece of why it's so important for the United States to focus on human rights is, let me just read it. In the real world, as lived and experienced by real people, the demand for human rights and dignity, the longing for liberty and justice and opportunity, the hatred of oppression and corruption and cruelty is reality. By denying this experience, we deny the aspirations of billions of people, and we invite their enduring resentment. I think this is the crucial element of this, of why the United States still does matter, why our leadership does matter. We need our partnerships. We need our alliances to grapple with the new issues of today. I think it's very important that we use that 15-year mark that Freedom House has been talking about of the decline of democracy, because this is also the same time with the rise of China, the rise of authoritarianism. And that's why it's so important that we focus on these issues of technology, corruption, and supporting, democracy and supporting a summit of democracy to bring, people together. It's really incredible that this report has really captured a lot of what we need to focus on for the future. And lastly, as we heard from our speakers, this is a bipartisan effort. We heard from Senator Romney, Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, Cindy McCain, John Hamre, and the members of this task force who have represented, administrations from the just previous administration to the Obama administration, Bush administration, Reagan administration, you name it. We've talked to a lot of people, and this is something that everyone can wrap their heads around. So, I'm going to conclude here because there's so much more to discuss. This is a living document. This is not the last time we're going to talk about it. So stay tuned to Freedom House, to the McCain Institute, to CSIS, as we continue to focus on all of the issues laid out, all of the recommendations, the 7 recommendations and all their subsets, because this is too important of a strategy to end here. So stay tuned for more from us, and we really appreciate you for tuning in today. Thank you so much.